Hello everyone, this is Margaret Reece from the UK. Firstly, I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak to you today about complex PTSD from my own experiences. My aim is to address what can often result in disastrous consequences when the body and mind are treated as separate entities. I should also like to suggest to you that the up-to-date research undertaken in the last 5 to 10 years by world experts in trauma has the potential to transform lives. Complex PTSD is not a mental disorder. Some consider it a brain injury. We are living with it because of what happened to us, not because of what we did. Hippocrates, who lived between 460 and 370 BC, the father of medicine, was officially recorded as saying, "All disease begins in the gut." That was nearly 2,500 years ago. And he emphasised prognosis, not diagnosis. Now, this suggests to me that he was on the way to considering the mind-body connection. I realised that he was a long way off from developing the far more complex two-way process, since the body and the mind are interrelated. But my overriding question to you all is, why has it taken nearly 2,500 years for this to be discussed and applied, even by professionals? Is it because disease, the physical, and dis-ease, the mind, are looked at differently? We live in a relational world. We are not meant to survive alone. But so many people are hurting, vulnerable, and they not only feel misunderstood, but they very much are understood, not only by the wider public, but also by mental health professionals. The result is a two-tier society of visible illnesses such as cancer, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, and invisible illnesses such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, BPD, PTSD, and complex PTSD. But you're probably asking yourself, who am I, with no official qualifications in mental health, to be speaking to you, the professionals? I'm a very ordinary person who has lived an extraordinary life within the constraints of complex PTSD. I'm married, have 3 grown-up children and 6 grandchildren, all of whom I'm very proud. I went back to school, did my A-levels and graduated in French studies at Warwick University as a mature student when my youngest son was only 3. If I hadn't intentionally broken away from the system, it is very probable that I would have been institutionalised for life, just like one of my aunts. My GP, after looking at my medical notes, agreed with me. But I have survived, despite a professional prognosis to the contrary. And despite the prognosis by a consultant psychiatrist only a few years ago that, if I even tried to reduce the antipsychotic medication I'd been given 56 years ago, I would become dysfunctional. All the same, I'm here at 77 talking to you. Besides my personal experience, I've also completed a few courses last year through the National Institute of Clinical Application of Behavioural Science, with leading researchers Bessel van der Kolk, Peter Levine and Stephen Porges. I finally decided to embark on research in my 70s because the diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, clinical depression and chronic anxiety disorder didn't represent what I was experiencing. There was something far more profound going on. something that neither I nor the professionals could explain. Winston Churchill said, "If you're going through hell, keep going." He went through hell. He called it his black dog, and he changed the world. I slipped through the cracks of the mental health system. Please don't let your clients slip through the cracks too. It's for this reason that I am passionate to give hope to some of the many people who can see no end to their struggle, and to tell them that CPTSD is no longer a life sentence as it was for so many in the 40s to 70s. But they have to reach out and ask for help. Their lives are very precious, and they deserve to thrive, not live in a seemingly endless darkness. So for half an hour, I'd like you to suspend your imagination. I am one of your clients, and today I would like to try and narrow the gap between you, the professional, and me, your potential client, so that when one of them says, "But you don't understand," something I say today may resonate with you. My life spans from 1940 until now. Therefore, I have first-hand experience of society's attitude towards childhood development in the 40s and 50s, and the diagnosis and treatment of mental health disorders from 1959 onwards. I'm going to discuss, firstly, the importance of nurture in the developing child, especially up until the age of 3, and discuss the possible consequences of the child who grows up with no predictable authority figure to guide her, no support, and with the resultant trauma that may ensue, and illustrate this with my own experiences of attitudes in the 40s to 60s. Secondly, the consequences of inappropriate diagnostic tools and ineffective treatments in the 40s and 60s. Lastly, the potential of the cutting-edge research of world leaders in trauma, as it could impact clients with CPTSD. So what was it like to grow up in the 40s to 60s? The pace of life was slower and far more tranquil. Most people retained their innocence far longer, and we were content with the simple things of life. But the potential consequences for the children who grew up with no one to guide and support them, this was a hostile world that they had to manage alone. The philosophy at that time was, "It is weak to show your emotions," made us feel invalidated and worthless, as we were afraid to show the hurt and vulnerability within. And why was that? Medical science was in its infancy. A little was known about the workings of the human brain. As a result, since the health and educational authorities were unaware of the consequence of childhood neglect and abuse, they didn't know what signs to look out for. So innocent children slipped through the cracks and grew up believing that they were to blame. But we each react or respond differently to circumstances. I internalised my struggle. I was a very sensitive and conscientious child, while others externalised it by rebelling. In each case, the coping strategies we developed were insufficient for us to enable us to grow up as a responsible adult, fully equipped to face whatever life threw at us. Now I'd like to look at the bigger picture. How can we expect dedicated professionals to produce accurate diagnoses and give the appropriate treatment when the knowledge isn't available? Diagnoses were based on what appears to me to have been a very limited DSM classification. For instance, complex PTSD, even PTSD, hadn't been heard of. There was little understanding of the complexity of the brain, so diagnoses were based on overt symptoms alone, and treatment given on a trial and error basis. When the treatment didn't work, many people were institutionalized for life and became even more dysfunctional than they already were. I have been told that you've all been given a copy of the first chapter of my forthcoming book. It's called Hope Restored, A Guide to Embracing the Storms of Complex PTSD. Lack of time prevents me from going into more detail. This chapter contains my life story, and it complements this talk by illustrating my struggles in greater detail. I will hope it just will give you further insight into some of your clients' struggles. If you haven't got a copy, it will be available on my website at www.hope-restored.co.uk. But if the website is still not up and running by the time of the conference, I should be delighted to send you a copy. My email address is margaretreece2016@gmail.com. In brief, this is what it contains. 1. The impact of trauma from conception to birth. My mum's mother died when she was 6 months pregnant with me. Secondly, the consequence of a lack of a predictable authority figure to guide me, covering the first 5 years. With hindsight, I know that both my parents loved me, but they were unable to guide me because Mum found it difficult to cope with her own struggles, let alone mine. I was unable to comfort my father, who was suffering from tuberculosis and an abscess on the brain. Here were two people, very much in love, but unable to help each other and unable to guide me. Then the death of my father at 5 years old. He was the only stable influence of any sort in my life. Now my world was not only hostile, but I had to navigate my way through it alone. The next 4, the impact of sustained trauma during the years spent at boarding school from 6 to 17. This gave me confirmation in my mind that I had to fight for my own survival alone. And I'd really hoped that I was going to be accepted, but I didn't feel accepted, nor did I feel any sense of belonging. I just felt crushed. The next phase is life away from the sheltered environment with no structure. I left school at 17. I couldn't cope with my mum's anxiety as well as my own. Even attendance at the day hospital nearby when I was 19 was too traumatic for me. I needed a complete break from home. I gave a cry for help, and I asked to become an inpatient at the main mental hospital in the area, and I remained there on and off for 3 to 4 years, desperate to be understood and desperate for the doctors to give me treatment that would bring me freedom from myself. They tried, granted. I was overloaded with drugs, given 30 to 40 ECTs and insulin therapy, but nothing worked. So now it was time to break away from professional help, for fear of lifetime institutionalization. As I said, my current general practitioner confirms that this would probably have happened. Because unknown to me, I had been misdiagnosed at 19 with what would now be called schizoaffective disorder. The treatment I had been given and kept on throughout my life was inappropriate and addictive in the long term. Now I couldn't even access professional help. Now the next period of my life was what I would call hell on earth, except that I was blessed with a wonderful husband. We had 3 children, a daughter and 2 sons, and now I have 6 grandchildren. During this time, I studied to achieve, just to survive. The only emotion I could feel was fear. I didn't know what peace, joy and love was. I was on automatic. unable to stop, trying to escape from my thoughts, from my emotions, from me. If it hadn't been for my husband, I wouldn't have been able to keep on top of the suicidal thoughts that I experienced nearly every day. But I survived because I was even more afraid of dying than I was of living. A catch-22 situation. Number 9, in the pits of hell. My husband died. I was 57. In desperation, I turned to my general practitioner for help. So we go back to the professionals after all those years of counselling. 10 years of counselling on and off. And I met the first person whom I felt had some understanding of where I was and what I was experiencing. It was only then that I found out about the misdiagnosis when I was 19. Then I had a second misdiagnosis, but only as far as it was based on overt symptoms alone. This time it was chronic anxiety disorder, but it still made me feel very misunderstood because there were many symptoms that could not be explained by this diagnosis. And after that, a third misdiagnosis of clinical depression. It was given by a consultant psychiatrist only 5 to 6 years ago and was based solely on overt symptoms and inadequate questions. She failed to grasp that the lifelong trauma had resulted in far more serious consequences. She told me that if I even tried to reduce the antipsychotic medication I was on, I would become dysfunctional. When a few years later, that very medication I'd been taking for 56 years suddenly went off the market, I had to come off it cold turkey. And my general practitioner knew of no one to whom he could refer me. Last year, I decided to start researching to find the authentic me. I came upon the work of leading experts in trauma on the internet through the National Institute of Clinical Application of Behavioural Medicine, i.e. Bessel von der Kolk, Peter Levine and Stephen Porges et al., and I undertook a few of their courses. But then we had the search to find a professional who specialises in trauma. I now understood the theory, but I needed someone to guide me through it. And I think this is probably one of the hardest things I've found in the whole process, because not only did I not understand me, and I was okay when I was just about coping, but when I had a really big emotional trigger, I couldn't cope. And it became a fear of not being able to cope. Anyway, only about a month ago, this came to fruition. We found someone. I've come so very far, but now I have real hope that I will, and in fact, am recovering. Now, today I'd like to discuss the potential consequences of a misdiagnosis. The DSM classification. There are still so many people who are trying to survive with multiple traumas and sustained trauma, and not enough professionals who are aware of the cutting-edge research. Up until fairly recently, not enough was known about the brain for even the experts to be able to understand the implications of what they were looking at. So it's not surprising that until now, diagnoses were based solely on overt symptoms. But diagnosing an invisible illness without looking first at physical evidence has led to so many diagnoses. Thankfully, PTSD has now received an official classification. I hope that one for CPTSD will follow shortly. So, why was the up-to-date research so transformational for me? Well, firstly, I discovered a diagnosis that encompassed everything that I have ever experienced, and it helped me to find the authentic me. It gave me back my sense of self. Receiving the appropriate treatment is equally important, but the type of treatment is critical to recovery. Early on, I was seen by a psychologist and on the receiving end of a lot of analysis. But since analysing had been the coping strategy that had got me into this mess, it was hardly likely to get me out of it, and I would return home feeling even worse than I did before the session. I needed to learn how to let go first, to listen to my body and to connect to my senses. It wasn't until I had begun to get out of my head and connect body and mind that I not only wanted but needed to understand. I understood that the origins, excuse me, have a drink. I understood that the origins of most of my problems were in my very early years, when the brain was in the process of developing. I think that my biggest takeaway was when I realised that lack of guidance in my very early years, with no authority figure to support me, could result in a change in the structure of the brain. It has certainly changed my worldview, and it accounted for so many of my symptoms. Why I felt so helpless and unable to cope, unable to take responsibility, and why I believed that I had no choice and found it difficult to make decisions. I understood the importance of a safe place, and I had greater understanding of the mechanics of the brain. Also, I learnt about the role of the vagus nerve. You can see Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory. And there was the fight, flight, freeze response. I would experience all three at the same time. I now understood why my limbic system was on constant hyper-alert. The mind-body disconnection made me unable to release the tension in my body, let alone my head. Dissociation and freeze as methods of coping with the emotional triggers and quite eye-openers, and dysregulation of the emotions, and they were made even worse when I came off the antipsychotic medication. And I understood now that I couldn't process my emotions. So when I came off the antipsychotic medication, they became, which had repressed me, they were even more overwhelming. Now, but if the understanding of this research has helped me so much, has removed the shame and guilt, and helped me to find the authentic me at my age, what could it do for one of your clients? It is now known that the brain can change at any age. Neuroplasticity, especially when the person is younger, but that doesn't discount any age. The work of Bessel van der Kolk, Peter Levine and Stephen Porges et al. Could be transformational for so many, because at last the professional could look at physical evidence before making a diagnosis. As a result, there is now an ongoing dialogue as to the efficacy of the present method of diagnosis, the DSM classification. Certainly, doctors do need guidelines, but the present method often doesn't align itself with the up-to-date knowledge recently discovered. I'm passionate to help others who are in the place where I was, who have lost hope that they will ever recover. And I believe each one of us is put on this planet to make a difference. So this is what I am tempted to do at the present time. I'm in the middle of writing a book. It's called Hope Restored, a guide to embracing the storms of complex PTSD. It is being published by Westbow Press, which is the self-publishing arm of Thomas Nelson and Vonderman, next year. If you would like to know more when it is published, I would be delighted if you would contact me at margaretreece2016@gmail.com. But details will also be on my website www.hope-restored.co.uk when it is finished. My ideal reader is the person who is looking for their safe place, even though they may not know it. They just know that they're in a dark place and they can't escape. They may have been given several misdiagnoses, like me, had several treatments, but somehow they too know that there's something missing, so they continue their search, just as I did. My second category of reader will now be health and educational professionals. I couldn't find a safe place, but in my 60s I found it in God. I sought him and he intervened because he knew that I was still unable to connect with him. Even so, healing is taking time, but I know he is in the midst of my storms. I slipped through the cracks of the mental health system. It's been so painful. I did lose hope so many times that I would recover, but I have survived despite the odds. Many decide that their only option is to end their lives. So I'm in the process of creating a Facebook group to cater for two sections of society. Firstly, a closed group where those in need will be confident that no one but other members will see their posts. And then a main section which is accessible to anyone who's interested or curious about PTSD. It's been suggested by therapists that it would be invaluable for both members and therapists if I included a list of therapists on my website and other services so that members can receive professional help if they need it. I envisaged the website to be of interest internationally, to come from all over the world. If any professional is interested in being included on the register, I should be delighted if they will contact me. The people who I feel would benefit the most are, firstly, those who need help but are afraid to admit it openly because of stigma. And then those who are seeing a therapist but need a safe place in between sessions. I found that very difficult. It's one thing to feel safe in the therapy room, but quite another in between. Now, one person can make a difference, but the government and higher echelon of power are far more likely to listen to the collective voice of the professionals who have first-hand experience of the struggles of their clients. So, what can you do as a professional body? Well, firstly, increase the dialogue between professionals, the government and public so that stigma is reduced and those living with complex PTSD no longer feel marginalised, or at least feel less marginalised. Then we can ensure that all mental health and educational professionals are aware of the consequences of lack of nurture in childhood and the potential of up-to-date research and potential treatment. Then I would suggest that we provide training in the home, in schools and in the workplace so that parents, employers and medical and educational authorities recognise the symptoms of emotional problems before they become more serious. I believe this we could reduce the workload of the general practitioner by having a mental health professional in primary care and include training within the medical curriculum for all doctors and nurses. The cutting-edge research could potentially transform many lives, but where can we get the funds so that our public sectors can afford to offer it, and that the majority, not just the minority of the public, can benefit from it? Our public systems, health systems, are under-resourced in terms of both finances and qualified manpower. We could give priority to prevention over cure. For instance, if we give priority to the younger generation before they develop unhealthy coping strategies, we are likely to reduce the financial burden on both private and public health sectors. We have the technology to give accurate diagnosis by using as our base physical evidence. More and more people find that they are unable to cope with the pressures and demands of a world that is more fast-paced than ever before. But unless the emerging technology is applied, complex PTSD will continue to be a life sentence of struggle for so many, just as it was in the 60s. Surely we can't allow this to happen, especially now that we have the knowledge to prevent it. But talking is good, but we mustn't stop there. It's time to take action so that we can live in a world where disease is treated the same as disease. This, to my mind, would have been Hippocrates' worldview 2,500 years ago if the technology and resources had been available. Thank you so much for listening.